Britain this winter might perform an interesting, if discomforting, experiment to find out how deep is its people's practical commitment to the environment. My guess is that it is not terribly deep. There is much talk of a coming energy crisis if the winter is severe. A possibility exists that the lights will go out, factories will close, and hot water and central heating will be lacking. A population unused to such hardships may express its discontent by means not wholly peaceful or constitutional. So says Theodore Dalrymple in City Journal. Any thoughts, Ben?
Well,
Where to start?
Yeah, where does one start? This is what's coming, and not just this year.
Well, he goes on to say, of course, the crisis might not come, so...
Well, no, it will come eventually. It's inevitably going to come.
But the weather might be clement, and the country might escape the worst consequences of its governing class's customary improvidence and incompetence, he says. You disagree with him?
With regard to energy policy, but that policy, combination of cheese pairing, corruption, and politically motivated appeasement of the Green lobby may yet result in a catastrophe, economic, social... No, I only disagree with him insofar as he's actually not speaking as definitely as he should be, because this is coming, it absolutely is coming, and there's no question. Maybe it isn't this year, but it becomes more likely every single year because of the energy policy that we're pursuing. The increasing reliance on renewables, which are unreliable, to power even more of the national grid than they can, combined with other policies, for instance, the proliferation of electric cars, the installation of new heat pumps, all of which require even more electricity than we currently use, means that we are inevitably going to be faced with many, many years when the energy supply simply does not match up with our energy demands. And that has really dramatic, profound, adverse, real-life consequences for normal human beings as far as heating your home goes or travelling to your work goes, for instance. Where is the energy going to come from in a cold winter when the wind isn't blowing and your house is powered by electricity that no longer is being provided to you?
Yes, I do wish advocates of renewables would concede every once in a while that the wind does occasionally stop blowing and the sun does occasionally stop shining.
Just to put it into context, so to follow the government's current green agenda, we will need to be using 3 times the amount of electricity as we currently generate from all sources by 2030. This is encompassing electric cars, the electric heat pumps that the government wants everybody to install, its other green plans, which all rely on increased energy consumption on the one hand from unreliable sources on the other. So in total, we need 3 times the amount of energy we are currently producing. Currently, renewables, which are supposed to power 100% or as close as possible to 100% of our total energy needs by 2030, produce at best 25% of our current energy needs. So at a time we are trying to triple our energy consumption, we are also relying even more heavily on technology which cannot provide more than a quarter of what we currently use. This stores up huge problems very quickly. It's not even as though this is a long-term problem. This is a short-term problem if we carry on with this energy policy, of relying on ever more energy-intensive sources of heat generation in homes, for instance, or batteries for electric cars, without the means to produce that electricity. And, as we both would argue, I think that there's one way of solving this problem, which is nuclear, which is the one that we are all slowest to come to terms with. But we can already look around the world and see the analogies here. Germany's average price of energy since it started its green transition has increased by 3 times, I think it is. And its reliance on coal and gas imported from Russia, which are both dirty substances, has also increased during the time when it's supposed to have been pushing for an increase in renewables, and also pressuring France to do away with its nuclear power facilities. So
what does Germany have to do with France's energy policies?
I forgot. Both in the European Union. Yeah,
yes. No, indeed, I quite agree about nuclear. Not that long ago, I was sceptical of nuclear myself because I recently watched HBO's Chernobyl, which doesn't exactly leave one with a good impression of the industry. But more
Except
people...
It does, because the problem with that is not the nuclear industry. The problem with that is communism.
It's communism, yes. As who was the scientist, Valenkov or something like that, something Kov. The scientist who was called in to investigate what actually went wrong and to clean it all up, more or less said this, the judge asked him, why were we using boron-tipped rod controllers or something, and he said, for the same reason that we do this and X and Y and Z, it's cheaper. We can't afford what the West has. Yeah, and you're quite right, it's a communist problem. But no, and all of the arguments I've heard against nuclear energy do not stand up. So just to take a couple of examples, nuclear waste equals bad. Nuclear power stations are massive and take up lots of previously unspoliated natural scenery, and so on and so forth.
So wind turbines don't.
Well, there we go. Then we can knock that one on the head. Nuclear power stations, relative to the enormous amounts of energy that they produce, are actually quite tiny, and the most recent innovation in nuclear technology is the small modular reactor, which is something less than a tenth of the size of a standard nuclear reactor. I think Mercedes is actually sort of in the business of helping to produce these things. A fraction of the cost of a full-scale nuclear power station. Just one small modular nuclear reactor can produce enough energy for whole towns and cities, essentially. We should be investing in these things, absolutely. As for nuclear waste, they're buried in specially produced sort of caskets, lowered into the earth so deep that not even an earthquake can dislodge them from their chambers and can actually be recycled. It's not like Homer Simpson taking a metal rod, nuclear rod back home, or for Maggie to play with or anything like that.
No, the safety argument has always been bunk. I mean, the safety argument is
more people have died working on wind turbines than the entire history of. I could be wrong about the specifics, but
no. But there was an economist who did work out that living for 50 years within 5 miles of a nuclear power station was as dangerous as driving 5 miles down an interstate highway or spending 10 minutes in a kayak or a canoe.
Yes, and actually working in a nuclear power station for 12 years is the equivalent of eating one banana
in terms of radiation,
radiation that you absorb.
And half the United States Navy fleet is powered by nuclear reactors. They live, all of British, UK Trident submariners live within feet of an active nuclear reactor. They are very, very safe. By contrast, and Michael Schellenberger, the climate activist, but I should say reformed climate activist, wrote Apocalypse Never, and San Francisco, which has just come out, which is a very good book. San Francisco, about how progressives are ruining cities. This is from a progressive as well, which makes the book especially interesting, because I think he would still describe himself as being a progressive. But anyway, he wrote Apocalypse Never, and on questions of nuclear as well. His Substack's well worth following, and because he also covered, and almost no other major news outlet covered this, which is surprising in a sense, predictable in another sense. A study was done which showed the actual dangers and risks associated with wind turbines and solar panels, for instance. One of their main part of the selling prospectus was that these are comparatively safe compared to all other forms of energy generation. It turns out that they were wrong about the environmental damage done by discarded solar panels by a factor of about 3,000%. No small number, this. The arguments for the safety of solar panels, which expire, you have to replace solar panels every, I think it's about 12 years. The argument that they could be disposed of safely, quickly and efficiently and cleanly is complete nonsense. They're actually doing immense environmental damage already, but we just ship them over to Africa and then let them poison the wells of entire towns. So everybody there dies of poisoning, but it's far enough away that the media aren't paying any attention to it, apart from people like Michael Schellenberger, who is an environmental activist, but is more concerned with what works than with what is politically fashionable. And one wishes more people were like that. But should we carry on with Dalrymple for a bit?
Yes, Dalrymple goes on. Britain generates more than a third of its electricity with natural gas, but has only 3 days storage of such gas. The government closed down its major storage facility to save money, relying on just-in-time supply from the Netherlands and other countries with huge storage facilities. But gas remains in short supply, and its price has risen dramatically. In the event of real penury, which Vladimir Putin will be in no mood to ease, countries that normally supply Britain will, quite rightly, supply themselves first, leaving the British to freeze. No one in the British government apparently thought of strategy as opposed to mere tactics. Not long ago, Theodore Dalrymple in City Journal continues, as its contribution to saving the planet, the Scottish government promised not to develop further fossil fuel reserves in the North Sea.
Oh, have to come in very briefly on this. So the Scottish government, before the 2014 referendum, published a roadmap to financing independence, when it said that independence was completely financially achievable and will leave Scotland better off than were it to remain in the United Kingdom, because of the revenues of North Sea oil, which they are now disavowing.
In other words, the S&P's entire economic forecast for independence
but the S&P's
is
entire
out of date.
But it was out of date before it was published, because it turned out that they were pricing the average barrel of oil at a record level, a record price that it had never yet achieved, apart from for 1 week in the entire history of the oil trade. They said it would fetch this in eternity as a minimum level. It's never achieved this in any years since. So we are in the enviable position of being able to look back and saying of the S&P government's prospectus, well, if you got what you wanted, you would have been bankrupt several times over. And this is before trying to cut your budget deficit from a record level 17% to the 3% required by the European Union. But this whole thing, and that not a single acknowledgement of a change of strategy has ever been made by anyone in the S&P, from saying in the first place, we will be able to bankroll independence in oil, which never fetched the price we said it would, to we will swear off all new oil exploration in order to meet the green targets, whilst also still remaining financially viable as an independence case. No acknowledgement of the contradiction between these two positions. The S&P, the phrase post-truth could have been invented for these nutters. They are sinister, lying shysters and should be called out as such. But anyway, so carry on.
Well said. Coal, the most polluting form of electricity generation, has been phased out completely. In 2012, it still accounted for 25% of power generation, and nuclear power stations have been shut down because of the ideology of the ecology lobby. Britain is the world leader in wind power electricity generation. It's not. It's actually Denmark, but there we go. Second, too. And so-called renewable energy has supplied half the nation's power generation on some days, but the government does not control the wind any more than Canute controlled the waves. Of course, Canute's point was that he couldn't control the waves. All the politicians' hot air combined will not move a single windmill's blades. I don't know.
I think
Diane Abbott, a lot of hot air.
Stick a windmill or like a gas generator above the Palace of Westminster on your average backbench motion day, and I'm pretty sure you could power an awful lot of the country. If we could find a way, on the other hand, of using smug rather than smog, environmentalists could also power the entire country with the amount of smug that they generate.
At the same time, Dalrymple goes on, the government has placed a price limit on what energy supply companies may charge customers, with the result that many of the companies will either go bankrupt or be bailed out with government money. Of course, rising bills are never popular with voters, so the government, with its infallible instinct for doing the wrong thing, has gone for the most cowardly option. So just a straightforward government intervention in normal market mechanisms.
Well, part of the reason we've currently got massively rising gas prices is paradoxically an effect of the price cap that was put in place on the amount that you can charge for gas and petroleum, for instance. So we're having this is already coming to pass, and the recent shortage has led to a number of very small energy companies going bankrupt, leading to increased demand on the bigger companies, because they are not allowed to increase prices and the rate of demand compared to supply. It's exactly the same thing.
Explain that a little further. So how are those two things related?
So the best example of this was the OPEC cartel's oil embargo in 1976 to 8, under Jimmy Carter's administration in the United States, where the OPEC cartel, the major oil producing nations in the Middle East, decided to arbitrarily restrict the amount of oil that they were producing in a bid to start an economic crisis in the United States of America, which they duly did, but not necessarily so. So there are two ways you can go about this. We're currently have been suffering a petrol shortage. There are two ways to deal with a petrol shortage. You can allow individual companies and petrol stations to increase the price to reflect the shortage, which will put lots of people off buying more petrol. Everyone will have to have less.
In other words, you can allow them to sell petrol at the market price.
The market price, yeah. Which is difficult for people in the short term, but in the long term is the only way of ensuring anything like an equitable distribution of the resource, which is in temporarily short supply. Or you can do what the government has been institutionally doing through price caps for a very long time already, but has also in America in 1976 to 8, did in this one particular instance, which is to panic and to say, there is a major problem, and to solve this major problem, we are telling you that we are going to ration the amount of fuel you are allowed to buy. We will stop the prices increasing above what you were able to afford. Now, in 1976, 78, when Jimmy Carter was in office and doing nothing about anything, apart from panicking, this meant, because everyone was told, A, there is a crisis, and B, we will make sure you can still all afford your petrol by price caps, everyone rushed out and filled their tanks to the top. When ordinarily most people fill their tanks halfway up at most, really. Very few people will do more than that, 3/4 maybe, some will do, but most people will do halfway. Because everyone was encouraged to panic and because the price ceiling was kept artificially low, everyone could afford to fill an entire tank just in case. And recently we've been seeing people filling entire tanks and also bringing Jenny cans and bags and all the rest of it to fill all of this stuff up with as much petrol as they can. Producing the actual crisis, which shortage. The government was trying to stop happening by introducing a price cap. Well, we can't possibly let some people go without, so we're going to keep the price low. But also, there's a real reason to panic, guys. So even the independent eye
economics.
This is basic economics. Price caps artificially increase the level of demand relative to the level of supply. There will always be a shortage in the case of a price cap whenever anything momentarily goes wrong, because the price signals are being disrupted by government. Now, in the case of price caps in this country, recently, the ones that Darwin is talking about there, the government has put price caps and has had price caps in since Theresa May's ill-fated tenure. Price caps on the amount that price increases could be imposed on gas, for instance, gas used to heat homes, until Boris gets his way with all these stupid heat generators. But nevertheless, price caps. So lots of individual energy companies, which were encouraged to come into existence anyway, because on the correct theory that competition is good for everyone, nevertheless were prohibited from increasing their prices such that they couldn't afford to keep the petrol coming in and supplying the number of people demanding of them. So a large number of very small energy providers did in fact go bust over the last 2-3 months, which only compounds the problem because then more people are going to the big petrol stations, which are increasingly running dry, because the price cap stopped everyone rising the prices to actually put people off. You need to put people off panic buying. The only way to do that is allow prices to reflect actual supply in the market. We haven't done that.
This reminds me of the sort of panic that people often express about what's called price gouging. Mm-hmm. And I read a particularly good sort of example by Thomas Sowell about this. So say there's some sort of a natural disaster in a small American town, or any town really. There's an earthquake, a hurricane, whatever. Lots of people are left without electricity. Their homes are slightly destroyed or dilapidated. They need torches. They need flashlights, as Americans would say. So someone swans in selling batteries for the torches that they have, because obviously their batteries will soon run out. So they come in and they sell batteries for the torchlights and the flashlights and the flashlights themselves. And they charge quite a lot of money. Someone says that's unjust. Lots of people can't afford those. Some people can, but some people can't. You ought to lower your prices in order that as many people as humanly possible in this little town can afford flashlights. Okay, you do that. All of a sudden, everyone comes in, buys 10 flashlights per person or per family, and suddenly there are no more flashlights for anyone. And also, the guy selling the flashlights hasn't made a profit. No. Because, he has a family to feed too, presumably.
And the cost of importing them also increases. So that's part of the reason prices must increase, is to reflect the increased cost of purchasing the thing to import it in the first place.
Yes.
If you allow these things to pan out, it's difficult for everyone in the short term. But the question is not, do you have some harm or no harm in this case? There is no perfect solution. The question is, in what form do you want to take your harm? Do you want it to be short term and relatively equitable? Or do you want it to be artificially prolonged by an attempt to make it equitable?
Yes.
And the attempts to make it equitable inevitably produce inequity.
A real-world example, if I may, during the COVID lockdowns in Italy, the government decided it would be a good idea to get as many people wearing face masks as possible to artificially set the price of face masks, which were in incredibly high demand, to 50 cents a face mask, or 50 cents a packet, or something like that, 50 cents for something or other. And obviously people went out and bought dozens and dozens and dozens of face masks, all at 50 cents each. The result being that there was a sudden shortage of face masks.
Mhm.
Because if they were sold at their actual price, which I don't know what it was, €5 a packet or whatever it was, fewer people would be inclined to go out and panic buy them. And to use another example of the same sort of phenomenon, which is really just the supply and demand phenomenon, the sort of loo roll, the loo roll thing in this country, at the beginning of the pandemic, people, including my own mother, complaining about the price of loo rolls. I think it's unjust that they could charge so much money for loo rolls, like 12 or I think the highest I saw personally was something £30 for a pack of like 12 loo rolls.
Yeah.
And the reason being, well, you know the reason being.
But you got people buying and reselling. But inevitably, and with no disrespect meant to your mother, all the people complaining about this were the people who were intending to go out and panic buy loo roll. Or gas in the case of the gas prices, or face masks. So how dare all of these other people do what I was going to do before I did, so I can't do it?
Yeah.
No, you are the problem here. Like, your irrationality is largely the issue, but principally an issue, the thing that can mitigate people's irrationality, because markets ordinarily account for people's irrationality, is allowing prices to rise naturally, depending on the availability of supply versus the presence of demand.
Indeed, and to return to my
that.
torch example, or rather Sol's torch example, were this chap or lady, chapess, allowed to sell torches at the market price, in other words, the price they needed to cover the costs of production and their own livelihoods, other torch providers, and this happens in real life, it's just the fact of life, other people swoop in who are selling the same product, the same snake oil, if you will, and push the prices down for everyone because they're now in competition. They're in competition with one another. That guy wants to sell more torches than that guy. How is he going to do that? By lowering the price of his torches.
Yeah.
But the other guy thinks, oh God, he's lowering his prices. I ought to lower my prices too. And pending demand.
And that's when the correction kicks in, because eventually you do get to a point where supply and demand stabilise, and
Yes.
then the normal mechanism of competition reasserts itself. But there will always be momentary shortages. That's the nature of the world. It's the nature of industry. And certainly during something like the coronavirus crisis, artificial though that crisis is in large part been, because it's produced by lockdown measures, for instance. Nevertheless, you can still account for these things if you just let prices do what prices do. If you try and step in and say, well, no, in the name of equality or equity is the current buzzword, that we will limit the price, then you are just storing up these problems for yourself.
And what's depressing is that this really is very basic economics.
It's the kind of thing that you wouldn't get away with. I think Thomas Sowell has also pointed out, if the average person knew as much about economics as economists knew 100 years ago, you would not get away with most of what politicians get away with today.
Mm-hmm.
But they get away with it because we don't. It's frankly, and this is slightly off the topic, but it's farcical that dance is a compulsory subject at GCSE, for instance, and economics is never a compulsory subject at any stage of education. Why?
It should be.
What does more good for people in the long run, economics or dance?
Well, probably feminist dance band does a lot of good.
I
for
suppose
a
you
lot
could
of
actually
people.
do a very good interpretive dance performance of the complete state of the modern economy, but I think that would just involve screaming.
Break dancing.
It would be one of those mad nutter social justice warriors screaming non-stop.
Shaking a maraca.
No! Shaking a maraca and yelling repent.
Yes,
Anyway,
yeah.
Back to Dalrymple, sorry.
Back to Dalrymple. Prime Minister Boris Johnson feels called upon to preach to the rest of the world about energy. He speaks as if his responsibility were to the biosphere rather than to his country. He wants to ensure that all cars in Britain will soon be electric, though he cannot guarantee enough electricity to keep the light bulbs burning. The poor will suffer as a result, and the resultant pollution will be transferred to Africa and China. China, of course, not minding about pollution. Of the fortunes that will be made, it is best to remain silent. Johnson is fortunate that his opposition is so feeble.
Which is true, because they all agree with him. But the point about exporting to China and Africa is doubly important. In a way I'm not sure Dalrymple means, but certainly could mean. We often are told, for instance, that the United Kingdom has reduced its carbon emissions more than any other country in the G7 by something like 70% versus the levels of the 1900s, I think it is. but in any case, more than any other country in the G7. Now, this is one of the only areas so far when I've ever agreed with Greta Thunberg, because she was right to point out that this is a bit of statistical trickery. It's not true that the United Kingdom has reduced its climate emissions by the level we claim that we have. All we've done is we've exported or outsourced the carbon-intensive production of goods we consume to Africa and not counted the emissions we are still causing by demand. And it's really, really dishonest to have done this. And nevertheless, the government, and not just this government, but the last government too, Theresa May's, and if you want to go back into the distant past, the last Labour government, everyone has done this. They all buy into this same thing and repeat the same statistical trickery. Because we are not ourselves producing the climate emissions, the carbon dioxide, in our country, therefore we can be said to have cut total climate emissions. We have not. All we've done is moved production overseas and stopped counting it. The actual per capita carbon emission for people in this country is still one of the highest in the developed world. We've not cut it by anything like that extent. And the carbon emissions will be produced by our demand, no matter where in the world they are produced. It's just flatly dishonest to say that we've cut them. We haven't. We've just moved them. Nevertheless, here we are, saying that, well, we're so good, we should slap ourselves in the back and nevertheless still do more. That we lack the technology to do so and the resources to do so. It's really, really, it's just dishonest stuff. In a way, that's a good thing, though, because if all of our green commitments turn out to be equivalently dishonest and meaningless, we might actually, paradoxically, avoid lots of the damage of these commitments, because we won't actually commit to them. We'll just commit to fiddling with statistics in a way that produces the right effect. The worst thing possible would be for us to actually take our own demands seriously and do what we say we're going to do, and I very much feel that is what we'll do.